I'm very happy to introduce Jeff Creek. He is the CEO for the Carbon Cycle Institute. I've had the pleasure of collaborating with Jeff and the Carbon Cycle Institute for many years now. And I find it extremely important to have this conversation because, as we discussed yesterday, carbon is at the center of all physical, biological, and chemical properties of soil. So when we sequester carbon, we can do great things for the environment and great things for the soil. Take it away, Jeff.
Thanks, Miguel. I'm going to really focus on this nexus between the soil, carbon, water, and the climate. Essentially, I think all of us on this call are aware of what's happening in the atmosphere, and it really gives new urgency to the whole question of the role of carbon in agriculture. This is primarily data showing atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide derived primarily through ice core sampling, and then in the more recent period through actual atmospheric measurement. And you can see that current levels in the atmosphere are completely aberrant with respect to the last million years or so of conditions on planet Earth. And this steady increase in CO2 probably began actually long ago, but we've seen a rapid increase in the rates of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last 50 years, 60 years. In this context, I think it's really important that agriculture asks itself the question, given the sensitivity of agriculture to climate and to weather, how do we manage risk in agriculture in the face of changing atmospheric carbon dioxide levels? What we know is that upwards of a third of that extra CO2 in the atmosphere has come from the way we manage our landscapes. While most of it has certainly come from fossil fuels, and we're all well aware of that, but we also understand that quite a bit of that carbon has derived from the way we have handled our working landscapes, clearing our forests, draining wetlands, and cultivating soils. Cultivation of soils has played a very significant role in atmospheric carbon increases. Somewhat ironically, perhaps agriculture is perhaps in many ways the most vulnerable human enterprise with respect to climate change, because agriculture is so dependent on predictable and repeatable weather patterns. We all depend on that, the last frost date or the first frost date or the first rains, the amount of rain, the distribution of rain, etc. But on the positive side, when we look to solutions to global climate change, we see that increasing soil carbon, as Kelsey so nicely outlined in the previous talk, is really our only viable option for achieving negative emissions. In short, we are not going to solve our climate crisis solely through reduction in fossil fuel combustion, although that is absolutely imperative. The only way we're going to actually stabilize the climate is if we begin to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And soils and soil management offer us that opportunity. The French Ministry of Agriculture recognized this back in 2015 before the conference of parties in Paris, and they proposed what they call the 4 per 1,000 initiative. Having done the math, they basically suggested that if we could increase soil organic matter globally by 0.4% annually, we would completely offset all global carbon dioxide emissions. Now, whether or not that's feasible on all global soils is quite arguable, but what we do know is that we can actually do much better than that on certainly in our cultivated soils in California. We now recognize, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has recognized that that we will not limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees centigrade unless we are able to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And again, the role of agriculture in this is critical. it's helpful in thinking about this to look at the global carbon cycle. As we all know, we're currently burning fossil fuels at a phenomenal rate, although thanks to the current pandemic, that has been radically curtailed, at least temporarily. But nevertheless, global warming is caused primarily by the combustion of fossil fuels and the transfer of that carbon from deeply sequestered carbon in the lithosphere up into the atmosphere. The oceans, of course, have done a beautiful job of absorbing about 90% of that surplus CO2 and the heat associated with it. But our oceans are now reaching saturation and acidifying, and we all know the current state of the oceans. So a lot of folks have looked to planting forests as a strategy for addressing this surplus carbon dioxide, hoping the trees would, through the process of photosynthesis, soak up much of that carbon. Of course, those of us in the West are well aware of the sort of the tenuous nature of that forest stored carbon, which really leaves us only one place to put carbon where it could actually do some good, and that is our soils, which is the second largest carbon pool on the planet. And as Kelsey so nicely outlined, as we increase soil carbon in our soils, all kinds of good things begin to happen. The process, again, as Kelsey outlined, is the process of photosynthesis. We're simply talking about this amazing process by which plants use sunlight as an energy source to combine carbon dioxide and water and minerals from the soil to build their own bodies, their own protoplasm, if you will, and in the process feed the soil ecology through the discharge of root exudates and dead plant matter. And so this amazing symbiosis exists between soil biology, the plant, and then ultimately the atmosphere and sunlight. Something we don't often think about, but it's fairly critical to this conversation, is the fact that all of the carbon in carbohydrates, which are the products of agriculture, originates from the atmosphere, which I think helps us understand just how critical this nexus between soil, carbon, and climate really is. Galileo clearly understood this, at least intuitively, when he said that wine is light, thickened to liquid. It's quite literally true. It's not just a delightful metaphor. Now, ultimately, all farming is carbon farming because all agriculture is dependent on that transfer of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the growing plant and the production of the crop. The question becomes, when we think about carbon farming intentionally, with a view to both building soil fertility or soil health, if you will, and addressing or hoping to address or helping to address the climate crisis. The question is, what is the net direction of carbon? Are we losing carbon from our farming system, or are we gaining carbon? My friend John Wick has described agriculture as the art of moving carbon between carbon pools to produce the products of agriculture. I think it's a very elegant definition. Just to kind of emphasize this point, carbon is the key to agricultural productivity and resilience, and I would say to risk reduction in the face of catastrophic climate change. All of the other nutrients and processes that we depend on in agriculture are driven by the solar energy embodied in the photosynthetic process. And once we understand that, we can really begin to understand the potency of leveraging carbon and using carbon as an organizing principle within our farming systems. With this kind of background, we stepped into a research project with Dr. Wendy Silver at UC Berkeley back in 2008, primarily to ask the question whether we could measure a small change in soil carbon in response to management activity. And we, to test that hypothesis, we simply added some carbon to the system and then came back to see if we could measure a change. And what you see here is a ½ inch of compost going out onto grazed grassland. This is actually in Yuba County, in December of 2008, very dry year. We were able to get on the ground. And this was replicated at the John Wick Ranch in Nicasio, California. I'm going to just quickly go through this, but what we saw right away, the first spring of the year, was that the cattle were gravitating to the compost treated plots. And when we evaluated that forage, we saw that in fact, the treated plots had higher protein content, undoubtedly because of the amount of nitrogen that was in the compost was translating into enhanced forage protein. We also saw a very significant increase in forage production on the treated plots, about a 40% increase on the coastal site and about a 70% increase in the drier foothill site in Yuba County. So that caught our producers' attention. We also measured an increase in soil carbon, which of course was our primary objective. And we were able to measure that change. And I think that was a key moment in our understanding of the work we were stepping into. This is a result from a model that was developed by Dr. Becca Riles, who was the main researcher on the project, who's now at UC Merced. But this is a very interesting graph, and I'll walk you through it. This hockey stick curve is the compost carbon being put on in year one, and the compost was only applied in that first year. And this hockey stick is the compost decomposition curve. So you're seeing the compost breaking down over time, but as you can see, it's actually over several decades, much longer than we had anticipated that compost persisting in the system. But what was really startling to us was when we looked at the ecosystem response to that one-time application of compost. And that's what you see, this scatter diagram here in the background is the ecosystem response, showing that in response to that single compost application, the system itself begins to capture additional photosynthetic carbon due to that enhanced plant growth, which we measured, also driven by increased water holding capacity in the soil associated with that compost application. So what we're seeing here is the initiation of a positive feedback process by which that initial slug of carbon or solar energy, if you will, going into the system is now driving a steady increase in carbon in that system over time. And that effect, according to the model, in any case, will continue for a good 30 or 40 years before gradually declining. But even after a century of time, we see more carbon in the system than we started with, again, in response to a single input of compost in year one. So this real think that we could take this rising curve of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and actually bend it in the other direction. Because as we look at the intra-annual cycle of carbon dioxide or flux of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we see that each spring, we see a massive drawdown of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as the northern hemisphere forests leaf out and as northern Pacific phytoplankton leaf out, and they draw enormous quantities, about 6 parts per million of CO2 out of the atmosphere, drawing that curve down. But then, of course, come fall and winter, much of that CO2 is returned to the atmosphere, and at the same time, we continue to pump enormous quantities of fossil carbon into the atmosphere. So we're forcing this curve, and what should be a horizontal fluctuating curve is this rising curve instead. In order to bend that curve, we need to draw down, we need to lengthen that drawdown of carbon dioxide each year, which we can do theoretically by increasing the productivity of our agricultural ecosystems. And at the same time, of course, we must stop burning fossil fuels. I wanted to touch on the T factor, which Bill had talked about earlier, because the T factor was a critical step in our understanding of soil conservation. And yet what we're managing for when we manage for T is we're managing this concept of tolerable soil loss, which means we're managing for equilibrium. We're saying how much soil can we afford to lose every year and still have a productive agricultural ecosystem. And that was a critical step given the history of the Dust Bowl and our massive loss of soils at that time. But more recently, the NRCS and others have really begun to think about managing for change, which goes back to that positive feedback process I mentioned earlier. And how do we do that? How do we manage for positive change in our soils? Well, again, it comes back to carbon. And how do we increase the carbon content of our soils, as Kelsey discussed. So here's an example from a vegetable production operation up on the Mendocino coast. This is the same mineral soil over a period of 4 years, a transition from about 1.5% soil organic matter in the upper left to about 6% soil organic matter in the lower hand. This was done primarily with compost applications, but also with cover cropping and avoidance of tillage. So you can see that the transition can happen very quickly with of course, a very large quantity of inputs here. There are many, many ways, of course, to increase soil carbon on working landscapes, compost and other organic inputs being a very potent strategy, but of course, cover cropping, as both Bill and Kelsey touched upon, particularly with diverse mixes of species, including legumes, getting away from tillage, keeping this covered, not disturbing the soil, prescribed grazing. Kelsey did a beautiful job on that topic. And then the whole question of integrating agroforestry practices into our farming systems, both for reduction of climate risk, but also as a strategy to increase the rate at which we're pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and moving it into our farming system for all the benefits that are associated with that. This table shows a series of risks that agriculture is facing in the face of climate change, and then the associated agroforestry practice that can perhaps help avoid some of that or mitigate some of that risk. Good example of a windbreak planted on the windward side of a vineyard. Hedgerows, of course, pretty popular these days amongst vineyard folks. This upper left is just a elderberry planting. This is a mixed native plant hedgerow on the upper right. Lower left is kind of a classic, what's called classic laid English hedge, where the standing woody biomass is cut, but not entirely cut. It's partially severed, then laid down in this beautifully meticulous fashion to create a living fence. And then all of this will ultimately resprout and be a solid green wall. And then here's a more herbaceous on the lower right, a sort of an herbaceous hedgerow system. Lots of potential diversity in hedgerows. Silvopasture, again, Kelsey touched on this very nicely. Not so much a concept that gets applied in vineyard settings, but adjacent landscapes, integrating livestock into tree crops or into forest systems, a very potent strategy for carbon capture. And then alley cropping, which here is simply the sort of linear arrangement of shelf belts, windbreaks periodically through a vineyard cropping system. Riparian restoration, a very, very potent strategy. This is work done by David Lewis's team at UC Extension in Marin County. And you can see this sort of before and after picture about a 30-year interval there. The amount of carbon that's embodied in that riparian system following its restoration. This is sort of an early phase of such a project, and you might think back to that initial slug of compost going on to the grazed pasture system and recognize that here something very similar has happened, in that the stream bank has been laid back, it's been seeded, straw mulch has been put down, a coir blanket erosion fabric has been laid down, the plants have been planted, and a heavy mulch has been put around each of those plants. So an enormous amount of carbon has already been applied to this landscape in preparation for its recovery as those plants grow. So again, facilitating the restoration and ultimate enhanced photosynthetic capture of that restored riparian system. This is an example, again, another riparian system, Stemple Creek in Marin County, and a quote from the producer. You can see this very dramatic shift that occurred from the initial phase in 1990 to more or less the present time. And the producer, in this case, Lauren Pancha, has had the chance to actually observe this change over the 30 years and note that along with all the obvious benefits, there are also 30 types of migratory birds now nesting in this system. So again, the biodiversity carbon connection, productivity carbon connection is very real, and this is a good example of that. So what we're really talking about, again, to emphasize this, is the flow of energy into the farm system and then through the system, through the food web, if you will, of the farm system. And it is that understanding that carbon is that really potent lever that we can use as managers to manage our systems for enhanced productivity, enhanced biodiversity, and enhanced climate resilience. All of this brought us to this space we call carbon farm planning, which was an effort to assist producers to recognize all the opportunities on farm for additional carbon capture. Basically, we took a page from the NRCS Conservation Planning book, we put carbon at the center of it, and developed a carbon farm planning process. We've been greatly helped. This work has been facilitated by the work of the USDA, their greenhouse gas fluxes documentation. This is the USDA Blue Book, so-called, published in 2014. And most importantly, the development of this very easy to use tool that was developed by NRCS and Colorado State University with some input from the Marine Carbon Project around our needs, specifically around carbon farming. Really now adopting this practice across California. This happens to be a livestock operation up in the northeastern part of the state, but really asking this question of, can we actually achieve climate beneficial agriculture through carbon farming? And in this case, the producer, we're looking at a 4,500 acre ranch. This is basically the output from their carbon farm plan, showing the practices on the left, their average annual carbon capture based on those practices, and then a 20-year estimate of their potential, which is at about 100,000 metric tons of CO2 sequestered over that 20-year period. When we compare that with their carbon footprint, if you will, associated with their wool production, we're looking at being able to offset their wool production by 6 to about 9.5 to 10 times if they were to fully implement their carbon farm plan, which is, again, we feel provides pretty robust support for the idea of a climate beneficial agriculture. These are some products now being marketed through North Face, their Cali wool collection coming off of this ranch, and based upon the carbon benefits of the work they're doing, they're getting quite a nice premium for their wool. Similarly, Stemple Creek Ranch, Jensen Ranch in Marin counties are working with Cayuchi to develop a climate beneficial line of blankets and such. And so there's the question of climate beneficial wine, and I know folks are already talking about this. So there's real opportunity here from a marketing perspective to really how the concept comes to the public. This is the Huachuca Creek original carbon farm plan developed by Charles Chimbre with the Napa RCD. Basically an overview of the vineyard, and then you can see on the bottom right the various practices that were incorporated into the plan in order to increase carbon capture on the working landscape. And a summary table showing a fairly modest, but again, this is a fairly small vineyard, annual capture of about 75 metric tons of CO2. And at 20 years, we're looking at about 1,500 tons. And the practices you can see are fairly standard: riparian restoration, hedgerow avoiding tillage, applying compost, adding some trees, creating a multi-story cropping system, and enhancing the existing shelter belt. And then also looking at some carbon conserving vine disposal options, including a conservation burn, or mulching in place, making compost, or biochar. So Charles, and I'm sure the RCD has been working on this ever since. I know Miguel has done a number of plans, has developed a carbon farm planning template for vineyards, which is, I'm sure, readily available. Finally, looking across the state and at the carbon, soil, water, climate connection, we have about 500,000 acres of vineyard in California. If we could achieve a 1% increase in soil organic carbon across that acreage, we're looking at 41,000 acre feet of water and enhanced water storage in those soils, and the associated carbon dioxide sequestered would be over about 16 million metric tons. So we'd cut the state's annual vineyard water use by about 25% and offset the emissions equivalent to the state's annual livestock production, or 38% of the state's annual commercial residential energy emissions. Again, just highlighting the really critical role that agriculture can play in helping California meet its greenhouse gas reduction goals. Graphic illustration of the difference in soil water holding capacity associated with increasing soil organic carbon. Exactly the same soil on either side of the fence. One side managed with permanent cover for carbon enhancement, the other side not so much. You can see the obvious impacts there. Recent work done by Alan and Lori Flint with the USGS looked at the implications of increasing soil organic matter across the state, the working land soils of the state of California. And you can see what this is showing us is moisture storage, actual ET, or which is sort of a surrogate for production, and groundwater recharge impacts, showing benefits at a 1%, 2%, and 3% increase in soil organic matter across really all the state soils, almost all the soils in the state showing a benefit from that, with some exceptions, primarily in very high clay soils or very low rainfall areas. Overall, looking at about a 6 million acre foot benefit in hydrological benefits from that 3% increase in soil carbon across the state. So 6 million acre feet is a lot of water, and something I think the state needs to be looking at. Overall, just looking at compost alone, and I don't mean to be pushing compost, but it is a very potent strategy. If we look at various rates of compost application, 3 tons to the acre, 6 tons, or 20 tons, across the wine acreage of the state, say roughly 500,000 acres, we're looking at somewhere between 1 and 45 million metric tons of carbon dioxide annually would be sequestered in association with these rates of compost application, and roughly 41,000 acre feet of extra water holding capacity in those soils. So again, just kind of a snapshot of what the potentials might be if California as a whole began to take its soil carbon sequestration potential seriously. And I think I'm out of time. I'll stop here, but just say that the good news, I think, is that we know this can be done. I think Kelsey's shown strategies for doing that. There are many, many ways to increase soil carbon in our working landscapes, and with all the associated benefits in soil health, biodiversity, and water quality, and et cetera. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think this is an extremely important topic, and while we wait for folks to type questions for you, Jeff, I just want to reiterate what we were talking about yesterday on our first portion of the workshop, is that carbon is so important when it comes to soil health. Anything that you will do to enhance your soil health, most likely is going to go through the carbon route. So if you increase carbon through all of these practices that we have been mentioning today and we mentioned yesterday, you will have a healthier soil. So I really encourage everybody to look at your farming practices with a carbon eye. And I want to let everybody know that the Napa RCD is offering carbon farm plans at no cost. We will work with you to develop a carbon farm plan that would allow you to observe where you stand as far as carbon sequestration, carbon emissions, and help you develop a list of practices that can help you enhance your carbon sequestration. Again, that is at no cost. We are fortunate we have a couple funding sources, so we're going to be able to offer these over the next couple of years, actually. So if anybody is interested, feel free to send me an email or give me a phone call, and I'll be more than happy to start working with you to develop a carbon farm plan for you. Let's see here. We do have one question. Heather is asking, what did you use to calculate the sequestration rate for soil when compost is applied?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the original Marine Carbon Project research, that was actually measured soil carbon change over the duration of the project. We now have 10 years of data. But you may be referring to the compost slide I showed at the end, where we simply use the carbon content of the compost itself to estimate the amount of carbon that would be added to the soil with that compost application. I hope that answers the question.
Sorry, I was muted there for a second. Yeah, I think the Marine project did a really good job, and that set the framing. But I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, but I think we're still moving along, and these models are getting better every time, right, Jeff?
Yeah, very much so. The Air Resources Board, for example, has a model they're using to evaluate sequestration impacts of compost applications through the Healthy Soils program. So that's one approach. I personally very comfortable just using the carbon content of the compost itself, because that's a known, we can actually measure that. Now, obviously, some of that carbon is not going to stick around. Some of that's going to be oxidized fairly rapidly, but it does give us a solid number to work with as we're trying to estimate how much carbon we're actually adding to the soil with that compost application.
Absolutely, and these estimates give us a really good starting point, and I personally think that there's no better way than measuring things. So that's why during yesterday's workshop, I emphasized the importance of collecting soil samples regularly. And you can actually send samples to a lab and get the carbon measured at a relatively low price. So the best way of doing it is to actually measure what is happening in your soil. So if you're going to implement a carbon farm plan, we try to incentivize everybody to collect soil samples and measure it. We have a comment from Stephen. The compost applications are pretty expensive, plus the Marin County project compost strategies really didn't look at the biology in the compost they applied. So there are probably cheaper, better ways to get the same benefits with vermicompost extracts and other compost extras, where the emphasis is on how those extracts enhance the soil microbiology in the soils where those extras are applied. I think that's an excellent point. I'm not sure if you, Jeff, have a comment on it. Our next speakers will touch base on some of these amendments, so we'll be addressing that a little bit better. But I don't know if you have a comment on or a response to that comment, Jeff.
Yeah, there's a chicken and egg question here, and there's no question that the types of extracts you're referring to are helpful, and will, if they result in a net increase in capture of photosynthetic carbon from the atmosphere, then they can begin to build soil carbon. The risk there, however, is by stimulating the soil biology without providing additional carbon, you could actually begin to lose carbon from your soils. So again, it's a chicken and egg question. If the treatment results in a net increase in photosynthetic capture, then you're probably on the right track. So what we know with compost is we're providing not just the biology, but we're also providing the food to support that biology. And so that's the distinction I would make.
Good. And one last question. Well, we have two questions, but the second question I got here is related to compost. We're going to have our next couple of speakers are going to talk about these amendments. So Trevor, hold on to your question. I'm going to wait for our next speakers, and then we'll see if they address your question. If not, we can go back to it. But the last question for you, Jeff, is have you explored ways through which remote sensing, IEG, satellite imagery can be used to measure soil carbon flux?
We have, we continue to kind of keep an eye on that. And there are folks definitely working on that, primarily using vegetation indices as sort of surrogates of soil carbon, assuming that there's a direct connection between the vegetation production, above ground vegetation production, and the soil fertility, if you will, and thereby soil carbon. I haven't seen anything that that I'm really 100% comfortable with yet. Chris Potter's done some good work with this over the last several years, but we continue to be dependent in those remote sensing strategies on sort of surrogates, using what we can perceive above ground to identify what's happening below ground. I imagine eventually, though, we will get there where we can measure soil carbon from space, which would be fantastic.
That would save me so much work and a lot of my colleagues as well. So I hope that we get there. Thank you so much, Jeff. We really appreciate your time. We could do a whole day just on carbon sequestration, folks. So I really encourage you to look at the resources that we have in the soilhub.org website for the North Coast Soil Health Hub, and also the Carbon Cycle Institute website. You can get a lot of resources there, and feel free to reach to me or Jeff if you have questions when it comes to carbon sequestration. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you.
Now that we understand the importance of carbon in the soil, and Jeff have talked about a little bit more about carbon sequestration, our next section, our next two speakers are going to talk about soil amendments and how we can enhance and increase the carbon in our soil and at the same time benefit our soil health. Our next speaker is Josiah Hunt. Josiah is the CEO for Pacific Biochar, which is a semi-local company. Josiah has been collaborating with us. We have a trial site in our vineyard where we are experimenting with different mixtures of biochar and compost, or biochar and compost separately. And we're very happy with the results that we have been seeing in our vineyard. So if anybody's interested to see what we're doing there, you're welcome to visit our vineyard. Josiah, thank you so much for joining us today. Please take it away.
Okay, I put it on a screen share already. Let's see, hold on, let me.
You're not sharing your screen yet.
Yeah, hold on, let me. Screen share. Okay, is everyone looking at my computer screen now?
Yes, just go ahead and start your slideshow.
Okay.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. My name is Josiah Hunt, as was presented by Miguel. We are based out of here in Sonoma County, Santa Rosa and Sebastopol area. Though that's basically where we live and have our offices. Our production of biochar is primarily happening in the mountainous regions where there are abundance of forest residues. And a lot of our processing is happening at large compost yards, particularly one out in the Central Valley. And also as I heard today, I'm probably been pronouncing it wrong for quite a while now, because I was not saying Nicatia. I kept on saying Nicasio. Anyways, on with the presentation here. I think this slide is actually, I'm just going to leave it here for just a sec, because this slide, I think this slide really shows a lot of what we're doing here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but right now I'm pointing up to the mountainous region. A lot of the forest residues, you can? Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
California has a forest health management problem right now, where our forests are in a state of, many of them are healthy, but the majority of them are not. And this is leading to catastrophic wildfire and other problems. So there's an abundance of biomass in these forests that the state is seeking to better manage. And so we can utilize that forest material to produce biochar, seen in this big pile here. And a lot of the biochar that we've been working with has been going into ag land, almost primarily into ag land. And a lot of our clients have been in the vineyard industry. So this kind of shows it right here. Now, to underline the importance of the urgency of what we're trying to do, this is up in Mendocino. This is at Fry Vineyard in Mendocino. And from what I understand, the fire ran through all of this. That hillside is gone, that vineyard was torched, and luckily the biochar was mostly put in the ground before that happened. But there it is. So in 2019, it's interesting. I didn't make that little line, but it just showed up. All right, so in August 2019, the IPCC put out a special report on climate change and land. The title is written here, an IPCC special report on climate change, desertification, land degradation, sustainable land management, food security, and greenhouse gas fluxes in terrestrial ecosystems. It listed biochar as one of the top 5 pathways, natural pathways for carbon dioxide removal. Now, this may come as a surprise because I still run into people, I'd say the majority of people still do not have a familiarity with what biochar even is. What I found interesting in this report also is that the chapter which had the most references for biochar was particularly the land degradation chapter, chapter 4. And that's because not only does biochar provide an opportunity for carbon dioxide removal, for climate change mitigation, but in the process, it has a significant potential for mitigating and even reversing land degradation, thus providing us with a climate change mitigation strategy and a climate change adaptation strategy. And I just pulled right out of the chapter here because I thought their bullet points were pretty succinct. And I think majority of what I'm going to show you is basically an extension of what they mention in this beginning chapter, in this beginning paragraphs of, I guess I'll just go ahead and read part of it here. Biochars generally have high porosity, high surface area, and surface active properties that lead to high absorptive and adsorptive capacity, especially after these properties. Biochar could contribute to avoiding, reducing, and reversing land degradation through the following documented benefits: improved nutrient use efficiency due to reduced leaching of nitrate and ammonium, and increased availability of phosphorus in soils with high phosphorus fixation capacity, potentially reducing nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer requirements, management of heavy metals and organic pollutants through reduced bioavailability of toxic elements, by reducing availability through immobilization due to increased pH and redox effects, and adsorption on biochar surfaces, thus providing a means of remediating contaminated soils and enabling their utilization for food production. Third bullet, stimulation of beneficial soil organisms, including earthworms and mycorrhizal fungi. I'm sorry, I guess that probably was a 4th bullet point and I copied it in here wrong. Here, improved porosity and water holding capacity. And for California, this one has proven to be particularly valuable. Improving the water holding capacity, particularly in sandy soils, and enhancing microbial function during drought. Biochar has been popping up a lot in quite a few other places as well, such as the CDFA Healthy Soils Program compost application. Biochar is allowed in the CDFA compost application. Interestingly enough, they included it, at least initially, as a means of improving the compost process. And that's the form that currently is so far allowed in the California Healthy Soils. So you can actually get subsidized applications of biochar through this program when used to improve compost. This is a brand new document with the NRCS. Well, I guess new as of this year. 3 states, not yet adopted by California, but this is a NRCS conservation practice standard that will allow for biochar applications to be partially subsidized through the federal EQIP program, the Environmental Qualities Incentives Program. under the aim of long-term soil organic matter improvement, basically soil carbon amendments of compost and biochar. And I believe a lot of the impetus is not just in the long-term health of our soils, but also in carbon sequestration. All right, so let's, I took a different approach this time. Let's just go deep and then we'll kind of pull back. So I think, hold on, I gotta try and get rid of this, whatever this streak is. Oh, interesting. All right. I don't know how to get rid of that blue streak, but I'm just going to go with it here. So what is biochar? Biochar is organic matter that got so hot it was a glowing red coal, but was able to cool down without becoming ash, thus leaving an incredibly changed material. The carbon bonds have realigned from being aliphatic, from being long chains, to being more aromatic, more circular in their association, thus giving it a high level of recalcitrance. This will last a very, very, very long time without becoming broken apart and biodegraded. The word biochar is just essentially just a mashup word. It just basically refers to biomass charcoal. Some people say it is more like a biological charcoal, although it's not actually alive, so I'm not sure how relevant that is, but it's a biomass charcoal. The word biochar is new. The material is not. Another word I think is more scientifically accurate would be pyrogenic organic matter. Pyrogenic organic matter has been around for about 350 million years, as long as fire and plant life have coexisted. How is biochar made? Basically, it is combusted without enough oxygen to result in ash. High temperature, generally above 500 degrees Celsius is optimal. With insufficient oxygen results in charcoal. With sufficient oxygen, and you create ash. The gases released can be captured and utilized for energy production and other purposes. Biochar and soil organic matter. So I just pulled up, this is kind of a common way to represent soil organic matter as somewhat of a pie chart in living organisms, fresh organic, active, decomposing. And I think particularly in the past 20 years, our understanding of soil organic matter has been expanding from what it previously was. I think we've identified quite a few different pathways for developing soil organic matter. And I think the concept of what soil organic matter is has expanded in complexity as we unveil and begin to acknowledge certain nuances. Biochar is a significant portion of soil organic matter throughout the world, though we don't commonly measure it. We measure it, but we don't measure it distinctly. Generally, soil organic matter is measured through loss on ignition, which does not differentiate between biochar carbon and non-biochar carbon. Thus, it shows up as part of the soil organic matter in our analysis, but does not get distinctly acknowledged. But because wherever fire and plant life happen, charcoal is created, and charcoal is very recalcitrant, it is more or less ubiquitous in at least some amount, oftentimes greater than 10% of the total organic matter. So if your organic matter was 10%, the biochar portion might be 1%. But in many cases, it can be found at rates higher than that. All right, some of the characteristics of why you'd be interested in intentionally putting biochar in your soil. In California, water is, of course, high importance. Biochar being so porous, as you might have seen in some of the pictures before, has a great ability to hold water. And because the water is held within these, essentially what are capillary tubes that were designed by the plant's body, developed in the plant and then kind of frozen in time in the process of pyrolysis. A lot of the water is more plant available than water that would be held against a clay particle, because there's generally a lower surface tension. So an interesting thing here, biochar can increase the water holding capacity in sand. I'm sorry, hold on. We're looking at hydraulic conductivity, different measure there. Forget those graphs for a second. I'm just going to talk about it here. So biochar can help increase the water holding capacity of sand, the soil. And biochar can, with a clay soil, not necessarily increase the water holding capacity, because clay soils can hold so much gosh darn water. But in clay soils, where it's particularly valuable is that the biochar can increase the penetration and infiltration of water into a clay soils because it is so porous and helps open them up a bit. And while doing that, the water that is able to infiltrate into that clay soil generally has a higher degree of being plant available because it's not held so tightly. And in sand as well, the biochar can help hold more water in that sand and also in a plant available form. Biochar is essentially a charcoal filter in your soil. Biochar can help hold nutrients in the topsoil in a form that is largely plant available, largely biologically available. So in a form that reduces the ability of those nutrients to be lost to the environment through leaching or volatilization, but while still remaining available to the biology of that soil, the microorganisms and plants in that soil. And that's a really important aspect of biochar, this ability to act as somewhat of a charcoal filter to help hold those nutrients in the soil. Unlike organic matter that can be broken down, the nutrients within the biochar are not necessarily, that's not what we're adding. We're not adding nutrients in the form of biochar. We're adding biochar to act more as a catalyst or a substrate to increase the efficiency of nutrient management in that soil by reducing environmental loss and also acting as a microbial substrate for reactions to occur. In that same way, biochar acting as a charcoal filter, it seems to be very effective at reducing toxicity issues associated with heavy metals and toxic organic compounds. Heavy metals such as in many of the soils south of us, it would be cadmium, lead, arsenic, mercury. These things can be antagonistic to plant growth as well as detrimental to the things that would like to eat them, animals and humans included, if at levels high enough. And biochar has been shown to be very effective at reducing the bioavailability of these heavy metals, partly in the same way that it's working with nutrients, but because there's less, I guess you could call it, desire to work with these metals, plants and microorganisms have great, again, I'm going to use the word desire for nitrogen and phosphorus. So they've got ways to help pluck those off the biochar, but then these heavy metals get stuck to the biochar and they just sit there because nobody wants them. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but a lot of the research gone into it has shown that the effective result is essentially that. It makes a great habitat for soil biology. As you can see in these pictures here, this is a fungal hi-fi, just kind of embracing that chunk of biochar, which is in a compost pile. This was just covered with a tarp. I uncovered it and found this little embrace and took a picture, just to kind of help show the relation there. This is a chunk of charcoal I pulled from under a tree in my yard, where you can see there's actually roots coming out of the charcoal here. Not just the exterior, the interior is also available for utilization by roots and soil microorganisms. And that's an important part. You can see fungal hi-fi, tree roots, and I think these are the grass roots, thus coming in and out of that biochar material. One interesting thing that happens with biochar when in the presence of all these microorganisms is that the biochar itself becomes improved. While it starts out rather naked, all of, in a microbially active environment, the biochar becomes covered with organic acids, minerals, and living organisms. And this makes the biochar material a more complex and functional material than it was when it first started, which is one of the reasons why we find that biochar ages, and generally your second harvest will be better than your first, meaning after an application of biochar, the yield improvement increases over time. I mean, it will plateau, but generally greater after the first harvest because the biochar seems to mature. An interesting thing I haven't touched on yet is that biochar, particularly biochar produced at high temperature, actually begins to form graphitic type portions, a graphene-like material, and even graphene within its structure. And these graphitic materials are able to transfer electrons across short distances. And for microbial activity, this is really cool. Biochar can serve as a electron donor and acceptor. And in this case, with these graphitic portions, as an electron transfer across short distances, which is greatly, you know, it's a big part in how biochar helps microbes do what they're doing and helps explain some of the results that we've been seeing that were previously difficult to explain. And here's some photos to kind of show the relationship size here. So this is a chunk of biochar. This porous material here is the biochar. This is a vascular arbuscular mycorrhizal spore. And you can see the hyphae just plugging right into the biochar, going right into those pores. Again, those pores were developed by the plant body that became biochar. On this side, we see bacterial. We see bacterial bodies. We see masses of bacterial bodies in and upon this biochar material. Just to kind of give a size reference there. When biochar is used in soil, we're aiming to at least increase the water and microbial habitat. One interesting thing, particularly from a climate perspective, but also just from a long-term soil health perspective, is when this biochar application has, you know, after biochar application, what are the interactions with the soil organic matter? What else? Sorry there, I forgot to turn off my messages. What happens to the soil organic matter over time? Are we causing, such as what Jeff Creek was just talking about, a kind of prime the pump type event where we have a positive feedback? That positive feedback is actually generally called negative priming. And instances where we have found, when measured over time, biochar helps increase the ability of soils to capture or to generate carbon beyond the biochar application itself. So in this one, it's called rhizodeposits. So that would be the deposits of carbon in the rhizosphere. So biochar built soil carbon over a decade by stabilizing rhizodeposits. After the biochar is applied, they followed it for a decade and found that the carbon level increased additionally compared to the control after the biochar application. Same thing, this is a study that just came out last year. This is here in the US. This is out in Iowa. The soil carbon increased by twice the amount of the biochar carbon applied 6 years. So not only, which is recalcitrant, lasts for couple thousand years. Not only is that still there, but the application of biochar resulted in increased carbon by twice the amount of the biochar that they applied. I don't think we can just say from these two research articles, and there's others as well, that it will always have this, but I think when biochar is applied wisely in a way that improves the soil environment, this seems to be the predominant effect. And as far as applying biochar wisely, I mean, gosh, compost is, if by now you guys aren't already considering how to use compost if you're not already, well, geez. And so biochar and compost seem to go really well together. Not only is compost fantastic for your soil and biochar is fantastic for your soil, there has been some folks who have looked at them as being competitive in some way. And I don't see it that way at all. And most others have found that too. way competitive that biochar and compost are quite synergistic in their applications. So if you were to apply biochar to your vineyard and compost to your vineyard, that there tends to be a synergistic effect. And if you're going to do that, then what about applying biochar directly into the compost? And so this has been an area where we found a lot of interesting results. One, as I mentioned earlier, when the biochar has time to mature in a microbially active environment, it develops a more complex surface with organic acids and other materials, making it more complex and instantly beneficial as it develops more plant-available nutrients and carboxylic functional groups. But we've also found that the compost process is improved as well, because the biochar seems to help facilitate microbial activity, and acting like a charcoal filter, it seems to help reduce nutrient loss. So we get a more efficient composting process, resulting in a better product at the end. And the biochar, while helping provide these services, is not diminished. The biochar is improved. So we improve the compost in measures of odor control. Ammonia seems to be really front and center. The biochar seems to be highly effective at reducing ammonia, as the nose will tell. Other greenhouse gas emission reduction, I have not been able to do a heck of a lot of research on this locally, because these measuring these things is expensive. But other research articles from other places have found significant response when biochar is used in compost at reducing the methane and nitrous oxide emissions, which are heavy greenhouse gases. Reduced nutrient loss, particularly nitrogen. Increased microbial activity and diversity. We found this quite a bit in the compost trials that we've done. Maturity and stability, definitely have found that. And then the biochar is improved as well, as I just explained. I'm going to have to start going real fast because I'm realizing here I'm getting short on time. Okay, so here's just some of the results. Again, this is kind of a mess. I'm just going to draw you right in here. We particularly found interesting results in the higher order stuff here. This is compost, plain compost with biochar, measured at 2 different times, right? That's the same time. We took 2 samples in October and again in December. Anyways, we found significantly greater numbers, I guess, I'll just use that word. Significantly greater numbers in the higher order stuffs here. So the flagellates, the amoeba, the ciliates. We found quite a bit more total bacteria, a bit more total bacteria, but particularly in the active fungi. In the active fungi was quite a bit greater there. Okay, where's the big numbers here again? Oh yeah, here we go. This one was easy because I put a little thing over here. Again, the higher order stuff, we're finding quite a bit of the higher order stuff, the flagellates, amoeba, and ciliates. The active bacteria to total bacteria, there was more active bacteria. And with the total fungi to total bacteria, it was slightly more fungally dominant in this particular trial. Here's another one. This is over at West Marin Compost. One thing we found here, and here I'm switching from the microbial to the nutrient, measuring the total nitrogen loss, we found to be rather elusive. It's kind of a difficult thing that requires a lot of, you got to be on it, and we haven't successfully been on it as much as we'd like to. But what's been profound is the difference between nitrate and ammonia. We find that here's where the biochar was applied. This is a living biochar one. Significantly greater nitrate and less ammonia. So here the ammonia is 220, whereas with the biochar it's only 24 milligrams per kilogram. The nitrate, instead of being 360 with the biochar, went up to 680. So the nitrogen results, we generally find the nitrogen in the form of nitrate rather than ammonia where the biochar has been applied. This is a common response that we've seen. And we're seeing greater seedling vigor, which I'm guessing, but dynamic here because ammonia can be antagonistic. Same thing here. This was with a chicken litter, biochar amended chicken litter. Significantly more nitrate and significantly less ammonia. All right, I got to move quick here. Some biochar applications in vineyards. Here's just some real suggested application rates. 2 to 10 tons per acre for pre-planting. Generally, this is best done directly below the vines, because with the young vines, you want to be promoting vine growth and not necessarily, weed growth in the middle. So apply directly to the planting row only, and combined with equal or greater amount of compost. Overall, we found this to be effective. For established vineyard, biochar in combination with compost, side dressed or broadcast through the whole field has been effective. And in some cases, it's not as common up here from what I understand, but in some of our clients, with one particular client down in this lower Central Valley, Bakersfield area, they're using it with their French plow techniques. So they're pulling all the stuff back, applying it in the bar, and then pushing it right back in. I'm gonna have to go through this real quick. I think we have enough time. Gail, just go ahead and stop me if I'm running too far over here. This is a vineyard trial that we've done with Monterey Pacific Vineyard Management Company. They're based out of Soledad, just below King City. Here we have an 8-acre field trial, 4 treatments, 4 replicates. We have the control, compost only, biochar only, and then compost plus biochar with the same application rates. There is some difference within here. You can see there's quite a bit of difference. This is the absolute vigor. This is from VineView. They do these great overhead flight services, and this is a calibrated, estimated. Oh, I forget what the EVI is, but we're going to go quick here. Anyway, so there's a bit of difference within the field, but they calculate for that to help get these stats for us here. So this is the enhanced vegetation index. All right. This is the control. Where does it say that here? Oh, I'm sorry. This is all blocks combined. Okay. Here's all blocks combined. Here we have basically just this color coded for vigor. Okay. Green is more vigorous. Red is less vigorous. This is the control. You can see quite a bit of orange and red. And then as we move further with any of these carbon applications, either biochar and compost, we're increasing the vigor here. Again, let's go back to the control. We have a lot of red and orange. Here we have biochar only. We're moving towards the green now, the yellow and green. Compost only showed even more vigor than the biochar. Compost plus biochar showed the most vigor of all. But vigor isn't necessarily dollars. You get dollars from your grapes. So we did cluster counts. Interesting, even though the biochar plus compost shown here was vigor, the biochar alone had the greatest cluster count. When it came time for yield, we found the same thing. The biochar alone had the greatest yield. Note, this is only 3rd leaf. Okay, this is a bit of an early harvest. This is only 3rd leaf. These are kind of low numbers. They're expecting to see higher rates. And this is interesting, but I wouldn't take it as incredibly conclusive until we've had at least our 2nd harvest here. This is several years into the process, but I think we'll be a lot more confident in the results after 2nd harvest. But I think it is quite promising here that the biochar showed a significant increase above the control, and interesting to note that it had a higher yield compared to the biochar plus compost, which showed a significantly greater vigor. Rava's index do pretty well there. In the past, biochar was seen as something interesting, but far too expensive or boutique to be of use to any large-scale farms. That is not the case anymore. We are doing this at large scale. We have truckloads of biochar amended compost going out on a regular basis. We are now large enough that we can service vineyards at scale. That is it. If there, actually, you know what? I'm going to leave you with one little tidbit. Here's just an interesting thing, okay? Many, many, many years ago, all right, split, this half of the field had a very high carbon wood ash. This is a high carbon ash coming out of a biomass power plant. But this power plant had very high levels of carbon in their ash. right? Almost nearly a biochar material. And this part of the acreage had this high carbon wood ash applied, and this did not. And this is 30 years ago. There's a whole bunch of these things, and I'm really interested when I find the right partners and the funding to do this, to actually go out here and do some more research, because I think there's a lot of available research opportunities here in California that we are not properly utilizing, looking at the existing biochar that's either naturally occurring or potentially even human applied pyrogenic organic matter. Again, here's kind of showing that soil 30 years after an application. Okay, I'll leave you with that tidbit. I thank you for your time, and I'll take some questions.
Thank you so much, Josiah. We really appreciate your input. We do have a couple questions that I think you already addressed as you progress on your presentation, but definitely the cost. That's the main question here. How much does biochar cost?
Gosh, I mean, just delivery, but by the time we get it landed, we're looking at somewhere in the range of $250 to $300 per ton delivered. We can beat that, especially if there's a large order where we have, dozens of acres, or hundreds of acres. We can do that, but that's roughly the price range we're looking at, roughly between $250 and $300 delivered.
Okay. Well, if anybody wants a specific, if anybody wants a specific quote, feel free to reach out to Josiah.
Yeah, and on a cubic yard, it's much lower density than compost. So on a cubic yard, that comes out to $60 per cubic yard delivered.
Not bad.
And yeah, you can hit me up for quotes. All
right. And the last question that you haven't addressed yet, somebody's just curious if you know of biochar being used to remediate waterways contaminated with heavy metals. You mentioned that biochar has an affinity for heavy metals in the soil. Any idea if this is being used to clean water? I mean, technically biochar is activated carbon. If we have filters at home, that's exactly what it is, right?
Kind of yes, but kind of no. So the word biochar is generally reserved for pyrogenic organic matter, biomass charcoal, when used or found in soil. If it's not associated with soil or farming or some sort of biological application, it generally is called carbon, charcoal, activated carbon, or activated charcoal. And it's just a nomenclature thing. But some of the materials that I'm working with meet the specs of low-grade activated carbon and are being used in filtration projects.
Not necessarily in waterways, but well, somebody was asking about waterways, but just in general, treatment, it might be used.
In water waste filtration.
In water waste.
Yeah, no, okay. It's being used in water. Yeah, it is, yes. But that's not necessarily what the term biochar is. Questionable whether the term biochar is applicable at that point. Maybe we should just call it charcoal or carbon or activated carbon at that point.
All right. Well,
it's we're running a little bit. It's semantics, basically.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we're running a little bit of time. We have to move on. But if anybody's interested in learning more about biochar, please reach out to Josiah. Last but not least, we have Will Bax from Marine Compost, West Marine Compost, and he's going to talk to us a little bit more about soil amendments, compost, mulching. I have actually had the opportunity to be at their facility. And for anybody that is weird like me and enjoys the smell of compost, that's a lovely place. They have so many different variety. I thought there was only one type of compost, one type of mulch, but no, they have so many different varieties. And I actually went and did some compost tasting, just smelling it and touching it. And they have so many different varieties that I really encourage you guys to look into the kind of products that they offer. With that, Will, please take it away. And you're muted, Will, so get your mic on.
Unmute. Okay, here we
Okay,
go.
now we can hear you. Thank you.
There we go. And we're not quite at the beginning here, so I'm going to go back. Here we go. When I started talking about compost many years ago, decades ago, I came up with the right column of the benefits of compost. And then in the early 90s, when I started looking at soil health and started developing some of the principles of what's related to soil health, what struck me is the perfect overlap between the benefits of compost and that of soil health. And of course, that is very naturally explained by the fact that soil health is largely related to the amount of organic matter in the soil. So that's the foundation, basically, what we're going to talk about today. What's in the soil? You've seen graphs like this here quite often. The air and water, that depends on how much rain that we had, or we're in a drought situation. That's a variable. The minerals stay constant. And then the organic matter is the one that we have influence over. Organic matter 5%, I think, is very optimistic. I think a lot of soils will hover around 1 to 3%. It would be wonderful if we can kick that up to about 5% organic matter content in our soils. Of that organic matter, about 10% is organisms, 10% is living roots, and 80% is of the really well stabilized organic matter that can exist in the soil for a long time if undisturbed. And it goes back to what people have talked about before and that you hear over and over. Is disturbing the soil destroys organic matter. And so if we want to build long life organic matter in the soil, build that humus content in the soil, we need to leave the soil as much as possible undisturbed. So when people look at different soils, and I have a lot of people come to me when there's an adobe soil and said, I never want to see that soil again. Can I add sand to it? That's not a good idea. It makes brick. What we can do is actually increase the soil structure. And even with adobe soils that people really do not like, because it's called a 5-minute soil, either too wet or too dry, if you add organic matter to that soil, it becomes a workable soil. And so what makes it becoming a workable soil is that we get soil structure developing in the soil. And that is aggregation, which we're going to talk about in a little bit about. So what does that do? Well, it affects the infiltration rate of the soil. It affects the water holding capacity of the soil. It affects the erodibility. It affects how roots can penetrate that soil and the aeration in the soil, as well as creating homes for the microbes and thereby increase the diversity and the number count of microbes in the soil. So how does an aggregate really form? And you know, it's like in this picture on the right here, take into account that clay is a lot more plate-like structured than and the sandy material is more like rock boulder-like in structure. The reason why clay is hard to work is as it's plate-like and water comes in between, it compacts and it becomes waterlogged. Sandy soils, rock-like, the water just goes through and it has no ability to hold on to that water. Now, if we add organic matter to that combination, then it takes these particles and kind of glues them together. But what makes really a stable aggregate is if we get fungi that weave their hyphae around the aggregate, and that creates a really strong soil structure in your soil. So what we want to foster in our soil is basically a fungal dominated population that really will create these aggregates in the soil. Now, if we create this great structure in the soil, there's a very good way of destroying it, which I do not recommend, is if you take this aggregate on the right and you envelop it immediately through flood irrigation or a heavy storm with water, you see the air pockets in there. The micropores on the outside will draw in water and put pressure on the air. And at some point, the pressure becomes so big that the aggregate actually explodes and you get a massive soil structure again. You have destroyed all the soil structure that you have worked on to build. So one way to prevent that from happening is by putting a mulch layer over the soil that will allow the sudden water that comes in from a heavy storm, an irrigation, or God forbid, flood irrigation, to envelop that aggregate with water, but slowly let the water get in so the air has a chance to get out and preserve that soil structure. One of the benefits of organic matter in the soil, and of course compost is one of the ways to do it, and I talk from a compost perspective, yet be sure that I also promote the use of cover crops and any other means biochar to increase organic matter in the soil. If you increase your organic matter in the soil, you increase your cation exchange capacity. A lot of clay soils may have cation exchange capacity, a lot of them do not. Sandy soils definitely do not have any. So if we bring organic matter in the soil, we dramatically increase that nutrient holding capacity of the soil. The microbes that come with the organic matter also will immobilize water-soluble nutrients. So if there are nutrients floating around in the soil water out there that normally with irrigation or rain would drain out, now the microorganisms will catch those nutrients to break down the carbon in the soil and incorporate it into their microbial bodies. Now these nutrients are immobilized and cannot be washed out. Upon the death of the microbes, the nutrients are being released again and are available to both the microbes as well as to the plants. That creates a long-term nutrient release. So if you increase the organic matter in the soil, you actually automatically build in a long-term nutrient release system. And then we have also microbes in there that then can take nitrogen out of the soil atmosphere and fix that nitrogen so that becomes later on available to plants as well. On a soil moisture management point of view, everyone's familiar with the sandy soil. It rains, it goes straight through the soil. It has very low water holding capacity and therefore very little plant available water. In a clay soil, there's more water available. A lot of that water is not plant available. And then there's of course plant available water. What you can do with the compost is actually increase the plant available water and store that for a longer time in the soil. Whereas in the clay soils, as we create these aggregations in the soil, we lower the unavailable water content in the soil and make more water available to plant growth. So on the left is a schematic of what would happen with the sandy parts where we now create this aggregate. There's more water holding capacity in that aggregate and therefore more water available. On the right-hand side, when we have aggregates with a lot of clay soils in there, we create now these macropores between these aggregates where water can filtrate out of that surface layer of the soil, create more airspace and with less waterlogging. What has been shown through research is that a 4-inch layer of mulch can save about 130,000 gallons of water in vineyards. Water holding capacity was increased by 40%, and the marine carbon project that Jeff talked about a little while ago, a 1/2 inch saved about 2,600 gallons per acre. So far, I think there's not enough research available on what really the water savings are in different soils, in different conditions. But these are indications that we have definitely a great water saving potential. On soil microorganisms, a little bit of a misrepresentation out here. In a compost pile, you do not see the macroorganisms. They are present in the feedstock before it gets into the compost. The compost gets so hot that the microorganisms will not survive in there. However, when the compost is mature, some of these macroorganisms will return. In the compost pile itself, we really have a huge population of bacteria and fungi. The compost then that results from the composting process is a tool in integrated pest management. And how does this work? Well, first of all, there are hormones, chemicals in the soil that increase the disease-fighting mechanisms in plants. In addition, there is competition. If you have a huge biological population of microorganisms, they clean up the site of easily available organic matter. So if a pest comes in, it does not have that smorgasbord of nutrients available where they can explode in population. Also, microorganisms feed on each other, and so the beneficial organisms that you have may actually kill part of the pests that are coming. Next, there is site occupation. It's like having a hotel room. If that hotel room is taken, that means that another pest cannot move into that site, and therefore the chances of having an outbreak of a pest have been reduced. At the same time, we get an optimized nutrient management, which gives better plant health and therefore make the plants more disease resistant. And we have the aggregation of the soil by these microorganisms that allow for a larger root ball to form, therefore a healthier plant above, and again, make them more resistant to disease attack. And as has come over several times during the presentations here, that the more diversity and abundance of microbes we have, that's a good indicator of soil health. Now, I want to make a distinction between compost and mulch. And I would say until maybe 5-6 years ago, this looked slightly different. The first line, I always said that compost is incorporated into the soil and mulch stays on the surface of the soil. That mulch stays on the surface of the soil is still the case. You should never incorporate a mulch into the soil. And a mulch is indicated by the principle that it has a large carbon-nitrogen ratio. It has a surplus of carbon in its material that actually will steal nitrogen from the soil. Compost, on the other hand, should have a carbon-nitrogen ratio that is low enough that it will not steal nitrogen from the soil and actually will contribute nutrients that it has stored in its material to the plants. Now, I used to say that compost was incorporated into the soil. What we have learned through the whole carbon sequestration studies is that the less you disturb the soil, the more carbon we can actually store into the soil. And so right now, I would say that if you have, for instance, a new vineyard, then put compost in the hole, amend the soil as needed. And then afterwards, do only top applications of the compost and do not incorporate it in the soil anymore. Compost supplies nutrients if it has a carbon-nitrogen ratio below 20:1. Mulch will not supply nutrients to the compost. Over time, some of the mulches may, because there's some embedded nutrients in there as they decompose, it may, but initially, mulch will not, compost will. They both will improve the soil structure. They both affect soil water management and conserve water in the soil. The compost will improve the the cation exchange capacity, the ability to hold on to nutrients in the soil. Mulch will not have that direct effect. Now, over time, as some of that may break down and it goes into humus, then it may contribute to cation exchange capacity, but not initially. And they both help in reduction of soil erosion. Now, in the early 2000s, I did a research in vineyards about erosion control under the bare space under the vine row. More and more vineyards abandoned the contour planting and went to up and down the hill planting, where you have the potential of accelerated erosion on the hillside. And so both the water board as well as Cal Recycle asked me if I could do some research on erosion reduction in these situations. And so what we did is we applied a 3-inch layer of mulch, and we called it vineyard mulch. It's made of yard debris. It does not float when it's underwater. We put it on slopes that were about 40%. There was absolutely no movement of that material. It kind of locks itself down in place. And so we put that 3-inch stake under the vine row. And what we noticed was, number one, as you can see in the graph out here, that we got about an 85 to 95% reduction in erosion. What we also noticed is that when the rain stopped, for days after, in the soils where we did not apply the mulch, there was still runoff and a sediment-laden water came into our sediment traps, still carrying our soils. On the other hand, where the mulch was, the mulch created the fungi to go into the soil and improve the water infiltration. The rain stopped, and the next day there was no runoff at all anymore. That water went into the soil. And so really what we're doing at that point, and the paper was not really about that, and we did not really address that, but what happened is that we actually increased the water holding capacity and the storage of water in those vineyards by having the mulch on that soil. And there's a link of that paper at the bottom out here. When you get the PDF, you can click on that and look at the specific results of that study. We've also worked with Josiah on evaluating biochar, and also with the Sonoma Ecology Center. They provided us different types of biochar that we incorporated into our compost, looking at if it could reduce emissions for our compost. I think there's potential out there that we may conserve some nitrogen in the process. I think that what I definitely saw is that it cut down on the time it takes to get to a mature compost. And I think that may be partly due to the water holding capacity that biochar has, and maybe holding on or providing a hotel for the microorganisms that make the compost more effective in breaking down its organic matter. When you do this here and you put the biochar in the compost, in that process, you strip off any available carbon that may be left on that biochar. So if you would apply biochar directly to the soil, you may see an immediate uptake of nitrogen from the soil, and thereby putting some stress on plants. When it has to go to the composting process, you have only carbon left over that's resistant to decomposition, which will not give a shock to plants when you apply that material. The compost will also inoculate the biochar with the microorganisms, so that the biochar, which I call a hotel for microorganisms, is now fully occupied by the time you apply it to the soil. If you want to use compost and biochar, if you have a mixture of the two and get the benefits what I just talked about, then you have just one application rather than two. And I believe that the biochar is probably more effective in a sandy soil, which is a very hard time in holding onto organic matter. So you apply compost to a sandy soil, it will oxidize quite rapidly. Your biochar will stay behind, and that is organic matter that is saved over the long term. Then if you keep up with your organic matter, either through cover cropping or by adding compost, then you keep feeding that soil and keeping that biochar active, because biochar needs to be active. That means it needs organic matter and microbes around it in order to be most effective. Jeff just talked about carbon farming and showed that compost can have a very beneficial effect on carbon farming, so I'm not going to spend any further time on this here. I'm one of the people that says most of the composts say that there is not enough market for composting. I sell out most of the time, especially spring and fall. We need to make wisely use of our compost and mulch to make it go the longest way, get the most benefits from it. Because in my belief that if we really start feeding the soil and building soils, we do not have enough compost or mulch around to effectively do that. And so we really we need to start looking at how can we most effectively, most efficiently use our mulches and compost to get the maximum effect of carbon sequestration and creating healthy soils. Use mature compost. If you use a mature compost, you eliminate the deficiency of nitrogen available to plants, because if you have an immature compost, you have several things going on. You may have toxins in the compost, you may have uptake of nitrogen from the compost, and thereby not get your proper healthy plants. So a mature compost will be much more effective in creating healthy soils and healthy plants. Do a soil test, as has been said before, in order to get a baseline of where you're at and what amendments that you do need to your soil, and then monitor the increase of soil organic matter in your soil. I have a Excel sheet that is available. All you have to do is email me. It has 2 tabs on it. One of it is for how you calculate how much acreage, how much compost to apply to a full acreage. That's a very simple one. You can put in what your cost of the compost is, including trucking, and it will show you what the cost is to apply that compost to your vineyard. What's more tricky is when you want to apply mulch or compost just in the vine row or just in the swath. And so now what you can do is you can put the number in here, how wide your swath is, or how wide your drive in between the vine rows is, and then calculate how much compost you want to apply to that, or how much mulch you want to apply to that, what your needs are, and what your cost is for the compost delivered to you. So if you want to have that Excel sheet, please email me and I will send that to you. Lastly, I quickly want to talk about at the Schoen farm, we started a model on-farm composting model that is a covered aerated static pile. And what that is that you do not turn compost virtually anymore. There's only one turn involved. You build the pile, of course. You put aeration pipes underneath it, and then put a finished compost layer on top of that. The finished compost layer serves as 2 things. One is to filter the air that comes out of the compost, and you will reduce emissions to the atmosphere by about 85%. It also serves as an insulator so that all the new material underneath it actually will get pathogen reduction. So in 3 days, you get pathogen reduction. It means E. coli, fecal coliform, weed seeds that are in your compost will be destroyed virtually in 3 days. Now, I always recommend that you go to a phase 2, and I call that the curing phase, where you turn the phase 1 to phase 2, and so it stays on phase 1 for 30 days, it goes to phase 2 for another 30 days, and then you can harvest it, and you will have a finished compost that can be applied to your vineyard. Now, with this system, as well as windrow composting, as well as tractor turn composting, I have a class at the Santa Rosa Junior College. This is available right now online because of the coronavirus. If you click on this logo out here of the Junior College, it has a link to the registration of this class. It says it's 12 seats available. I requested that they open that up, and there will be probably at least 15 more seats being made available. This class begins in August of this year. So if you have anyone within your organization that's interested in learning about on-farm composting, I highly recommend that you take this class. I hold back no secrets of all the years that I have of composting since 1982. All the information that I have is available in that class. And I think that completes my presentation. I give that back to you, Miguel.
Thank you so much, Will. That was very interesting. And I really encourage everybody to talk to your local composting facilities. Visit them, look at the process. It is very educational. If you get to visit West Marin at some point, coordinate with Will if that's possible. It's an amazing facility. You'll definitely feel much more comfortable about where the product comes from. One of the things that I mean, we can buy it from Sonoma Recycling here in Sonoma, and it is a great quality product. The unfortunate thing about buying from local recycling facilities is that inevitably there's going to be some materials there that you don't want, although it's a high quality product. I have seen West Marin's compost hand. I have touched it, I have smelled it, and I just love what they're doing. It's amazing, and just it's a great way to sequester more carbon, avoid things going into the landfill. So I really, really encourage everybody to look into your local composting facilities or look into doing it yourself in your own agricultural operations. Okay, so let's see the kind of questions that we have here. So let's go look. We had an early question from Trevor. I'm gonna go back and read it. This question was given to us when Jeff was talking about, I believe when Jeff was talking about carbon sequestration, but this applies more to you, Will. So Trevor is asking, how can agricultural sites determine the type of compost to apply to their soils? I know food waste and municipal compost have lower carbon to nitrogen ratios, where green waste, wood waste compost have higher carbon to nitrogen ratios. How do we choose the right type of compost? Great question.
Yeah. So let me address that. If it depends on what kind of compost you're going to make. And when you use compost, I would say, regardless what the source is, you want to have a carbon nitrogen ratio of at least below 20. Because if you're below 20, you have now nutrient availability and you do not rob from the soil. So that is just a blank statement on more of like a mature compost. Of course, you want to use the lab results as well, that, you know, it's like you have your seed germination and vigor in the plants. Now, when you get to the different carbon nitrogen ratio and what the material is made for, now you really have to look for, I design compost to the end use. And a lot of people don't do that. If you have a vineyard, you probably do not want to have a high nitrogen compost, because you don't want to see a lot of lanky, high leaf growth on your vine. You want build structure on the vine and have a lower nitrogen compost. That's why West Marine Compost, and I had that at Sonoma Compost, is I made different products of a high nitrogen and a low nitrogen compost. Now that, of course, will affect your carbon nitrogen ratio. If you have more nitrogen in your compost, the carbon nitrogen ratio will come down. And so in a high nitrogen compost, your carbon nitrogen ratio may be as low as about 13, 14, 15. Whereas a low nitrogen compost may be around 17, 18, 19 when it's mature. So that's the difference out there. So understand that actually the nitrogen percentage gives you a different carbon nitrogen ratio, but you really want to look at, when does the compost become a compost that makes nitrogen available to your plants rather than rob it from your plants? Does that make sense? I can't hear you.
Sorry, I think that addresses the question quite well. Trevor is happy, so that's good. I think that we did, that's quite important. So yesterday, well, we did talk about the differences and the importance of carbon to nitrogen ratio when it comes to just the nitrogen availability, but also how the carbon is going to be processed by the microbes. But I think your insight is actually very valuable. And I think this is very important to clear out, that you should reach out to your composting facilities and they should be able to provide you this kind of information. Correct me if I'm wrong, Will, but are you guys required by California law to actually do testing on your compost, right? So you should have reports on.
Well, let me explain that. Let me explain that. Because there is some stuff that we can say and some stuff that we cannot say, depending on what kind of facility you are. So we are required by law to provide you with laboratory analysis that shows that there was pathogen reduction. In other words, you have a material that is safe to use, that you will not get diseases, and I mean human diseases, from that compost, particularly if you use vegetable production. Now, we also have to prove that we meet the heavy metals levels, which are very relaxed for the United States. I also make biodynamic compost, and I was the one that actually required to the Biodynamic Association, Demeter, that they would lower the standards for heavy metals in compost to be more aligned with the European and Canadian standards, which are much stricter. That information can be relayed. Now, when it comes to nutrient levels, that again depends on how you are listed, or if you are listed with the California Department of Food and Agriculture. California Department of Food and Agriculture, if you claim nutrient content in the soil, so if I would show you what my nutrient content is in my compost, I have to be listed as a fertilizer. Not all compost facilities will do that. It would be against the law to provide you with a nutrient analysis if you are not listed as such. Now, if you are a organic input material, in other words, you say that I'm an allowed material for organic growing. So if you have an organic vineyard and you need to have an organic compost, again, you have to be listed with the California Department of Food and Agriculture. To that extent, OMRI is not valid in California. A lot of people ask if we are OMRI. OMRI is not valid in California. It is California Department of Food and Agriculture that you need to be listed for as an organic input material. I hope that helps.
That does help a lot, Will. And I think that that puts it into perspective that you have to communicate with the composting facility so that you're getting the product that you think you're getting. Some facilities may offer more alternatives than others. So it is important that you communicate with them. And there's lots of them in Napa. But if you're looking for a specific product, then you might have to expand out of Napa County in order to get that product that will meet your
in Napa,
objectives.
I think you have Upper Valley out there, and you have Napa Garbage and Recycling with their products out there. And so, yeah, communicate with them, because to me, compost is really a commodity that as much as possible should stay local. You know, it's like, and if you cannot find the product that you need and that you want that meets your expectation, then you have to go outside of your area. But I always took pride when I worked, I'm the owner of Sonoma Compost, and we sold 95% of the mulches and compost within an hour's drive of our facility. And even though we got requests Half Moon Bay all the way into Oregon and the foothills, that is not the ecological principle of local recycling with organics. You know, it's like we really should keep that as local as possible.
That is very, very interesting point. Well, I agree with you there, because I mean, if you are trying to contribute to environmental causes, then you driving truckloads of compost miles and miles away, it's going to be creating some pollution as well. So
Well, pollution,
I like that.
Also looking at, so you have the air pollution, the biofuels that you pick up, not biofuel, fuels that you pick up, but look at your cost as well. Once you start trucking out, probably the cost of hauling will exceed the cost of your products.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Will. We don't have any more questions for you. We really appreciate your time and your input in these very important topics. And with that, folks, this will conclude our workshop for today. I just want to mention one last time, please visit the North Coast Soil Hub website, the collaboration between Mendocino, Napa, and Sonoma County RCDs. And if you get a chance, please sign up for the mailing list there. Any workshops, events that are happening in the North Coast region related to vineyards and soil, we posted there. Also try to join the Napa RCD mailing list, because that's the best way for you to get in touch with the workshops and events that we're doing based on agriculture. If you have any questions, comments, concerns about any of the presentations that were done today, please feel free to email me or call me if you have any questions, and we'll be more than happy to help you. Thank you for your time. We're here to help, and hope that we can see you out in the field and that we can help out with any concerns or projects that you may have. Thank you very much. Have a good one. And thank you so much.